Welcome to Gritty, the channel where I review crime fiction and crime-esque fiction with a focus on novels, short stories, and other printed media. Today I'm going to start off with an atypical example of a crime novel, but I think a good example of what is possible within the crime genre. So this book is one of my favorites. It is Clockers by Richard Price. Richard Price, definitely considered the GOAT as far as crime fiction is concerned. I personally believe that with the untimely death of Toni Morrison, he is probably the best living American author right now. If you're not familiar with Clockers and you're not familiar with Richard Price, you're probably familiar with what he's done as a producer and screenwriter. So specifically, he wrote for HBO's The Wire, starting with season 3. And more recently, he worked on The Outsider, which was an adaptation of a Stephen King novel. I don't remember if that was on HBO or Showcase. Another HBO classic that he wrote and I believe was the showrunner for was The Night Of. Obviously, definitely a heavyweight in the entertainment show business world. Now, Clockers, when it came out in 1992, was a bestseller, and it also got a lot of attention because this was the first novel Richard had released in 9 years. So after his first novel, which was The Wanderers, he released about 4 or 5 other novels, and by his own admission, these were mostly autobiographical. They were about his experience growing up. They were about his experience with relationships, going to university, etc., etc. The last novel he released before going on this hiatus was The Breaks, which came out in 1983. By 1983, Richard Price felt that he had ran out of material. He had pretty much written all of his experiences. This is what I have ascertained from various interviews he's done. So at that point, he decided to pursue a full-time career as a screenwriter in Hollywood, and it was to much success. When he went to Hollywood, he wrote the script for the movie The Color of Money, as with Paul Newman and Tom Cruise. It was also directed by Martin Scorsese. And then later on in 1989, he wrote the screenplay for Sea of Love, which would star Al Pacino and Ellen Barkin. Right. So during this time, he said that he learned a lot about doing research because he had to do research for the various projects he was given. And at some point, he went back to his hometown in the Bronx, his home neighborhood, and saw what was happening with the crack epidemic. So he likened the projects of his old neighborhood to tiger cages. Realistically, the war on drugs, the crack epidemic, had become so violent that it made life untenable for much of the residents there. So that's a little bit about Richard Price. Now I'm going to get into the novel itself. So this novel is a kind of murder mystery crime story, though I think that might be a little bit misleading. But I'm going to get into the plot now by introducing the 2 main characters, the protagonist, Strike, and the antagonist, Rocco Klein. So the character of Strike is a 19-year-old crack dealer. He deals crack in his mother's old projects or around the streets, around the old tenement buildings. He is very proficient. He's very good at selling crack. He's very good at getting the fiends, the drug addicts, to come back. He knows how to sell it and make a wide profit margin for himself. And he is capable of inflicting violence. So he is able to inflict violence on his other crewmates, so people who technically are under his command, so to speak, as well as drug addicts when they get out of line, such as asking him for free drugs, or if they get too close to him, or if they start smoking crack on the project grounds, which he doesn't like because A, it brings too much attention from the police, B, he finds it disgusting. However, Strike is not a kind of typical drug dealer. He is a very high-strung, very anxious person, very neurotic. He has an ulcer, which flares up during times of high stress. He also has a stutter, which also begins to act up on him and betray him whenever he's in a moment of high anxiety. We very much get the sense that Strike is a human being without really seeing him act on a lot of empathy or do necessarily altruistic behavior. At least that's for the first half of the novel. So he's certainly not a selfless character for most of the novel, but you really do get the sense that he has been traumatized by much of the violence that occurs on a day-to-day basis because he's in the drug game. Strike deals crack for a large African-American gang, which is headed up by another 19-year-old drug dealer named Champ. Now, Strike comes into contact with Champ very seldom in the novel. He actually works directly under one of Champ's lieutenants, whose name is Rodney Little. Now, Rodney Little is another kind of antagonist in the novel. He is very much a mentor and father figure to Strike. He also is sometimes a source of comic relief. He is at times quite buffoonish. He has a motor mouth. He definitely talks too much. He sometimes makes silly mistakes which no one corrects him on because they're too minor, they don't affect the drug dealing, and B, everyone is quite frightened of him because of his power. So this creates a interesting dynamic for Strike, that Strike works under Rodney, but constantly feels tension because Rodney is talking too much, and Rodney is constantly pushing Strike in directions that Strike doesn't want to go. This leads to the central conflict of the novel, because Strike finds out that Rodney is dealing drugs on the side. So he is acquiring drugs from New York, from a New York source instead of from Champ, and he is selling the drugs through a small dive restaurant or kind of greasy spoon type of restaurant that sells fried fish. Strike knows that if Champ finds this out, that the two of them will be killed, or at least Rodney will be killed, and Strike will later be killed if he participates. But irregardless, Strike is certainly enchanted with the idea of selling drugs out of a restaurant because he is tired of constantly being exposed out in the element, in the streets, selling drugs, where he is constantly being harassed by drug addicts, by stick-up boys, and constantly being raided by the police. So in order for Strike to gain this opportunity to sell drugs out of the restaurant, he needs to kill the person that Rodney currently has selling drugs out of the restaurant, name of Daryl Adams. This is the kind of big crisis for Strike around the middle of the novel. It is the catalyst for the main plot and the murder mystery. Strike is capable of violence, as I've said before. He has been to jail. He is currently on parole. He is capable of selling drugs and doing a good job, but he has never had to commit the ultimate sin of committing murder. And now his lieutenant, for all purposes, his boss, Rodney, is telling him to commit the murder. So I'm not going to go any further into Strike so that I don't spoil the novel. So I'm now going to switch to the antagonist, or the other main character, Rocco Klein. Now, before I continue on introducing the characters and the plot, I should mention that this novel is set specifically in the fictional town of Dempsey, New Jersey. Richard Price, I believe, wanted to set this novel somewhere like Brooklyn or the Bronx, but mostly was given access to the police and the precincts in New Jersey, specifically Jersey City. So Dempsey is a fictional version of Jersey City, New Jersey, the real city of Jersey City. I believe it's also an amalgamation of Jersey City with Newark. That's that. So when I said the side hustle of Rodney Little was he was buying drugs from New York City, that's why. He was supposed to get his drugs from Champ, who is a local Dempsey drug dealer. Strike also deals in I believe it's the O'Brien homes of Dempsey. So this novel feels kind of like a New York story, but it is not set in New York, despite the fact that Richard Price was a New Yorker. All right, so our antagonist of the novel is Rocco Klein. Rocco Klein is a homicide detective in the town of Dempsey. He works out of the prosecutor's office. Rocco Klein is described as a heavy-set detective in his early 40s. There's emphasis on the fact that he, despite his first name, is Jewish. Rocco is actually a nickname. His real name is David Klein. And he's very much presented as the everyman. He lives in New York, so he works in Dempsey, and then he goes home to New York, where he has a young wife and an infant daughter. So he cares very much about the things that most of us do, especially as we get on in age. He worries about his child. He worries about leaving them enough money since he is significantly older than his spouse. He worries about bills. He is worn down from the job and looking for a way out. Interestingly, in the novel, early on, Rocco is being shadowed by this Hollywood type, Sean Towie, who is an actor. Sean Towie is shadowing Rocco and his partner, Larry Mazzilli, to do some field research on a role for an upcoming movie. Rocco is very much kind of seduced by Towie as a movie star, and he fantasizes and romanticizes the idea of perhaps changing jobs and going into show business. He does not have the same hostility towards Towie that his partner Mazzilli does. And that's a key part of the novel. So you see this aspect where Klein very much wants to get out of the life. He is worn down, very much like Strike. He is traumatized by the trials and tribulations of constantly being on the crime beat, constantly investigating murders, and doesn't see the appeal. He doesn't understand why Towie would willingly put himself into the life of a police officer, into the life of crime. Rocco's hopes of following Towie into a possible movie set or changing careers, that ends up going south for Rocco. And so what happens is he starts looking for a mission. He starts looking for something in his job to give his job meaning, and he starts breaking some of the patterns that he has acclimated himself into doing as a homicide detective out of the prosecutor's office. So Rocco is assigned to the murder of a drug dealer in Rodney Little and Champ's gang. I'm not going to be too specific. And this investigation by Rocco and his obsession with the murder and feeling like it's this mission brings him closer and closer to the character of Strike, who is also, his real name would be Ronald Dunham. So Rocco Klein and Ronald Dunham are on a collision course, and in this novel we see how both of their lives parallel one another. Specifically, Strike mentions early on in the novel that he can't trust anyone, including not only Rodney Little, which I've gone over, but also his own crewmates. Rocco himself has the same kind of paranoia when it comes to the other detectives in the prosecutor's office. They're all kind of hotshots, they're all career-minded, and so there's very much this aspect where Rocco feels like he might be undercut by one of his fellow detectives. Now, Rocco's partner, Mazzilli, is a kind of Rodney Little character in Rocco Klein's life for a couple reasons. Number one, Mazzilli is not only a friend to Rocco, but also a kind of mentor. Number two, Mazzilli, like Rodney Little, has a far harsher view on their occupation than their counterparts. So, like I said, Strike is certainly a human being. He has these feelings of high stress and neurosis when it comes to the drug dealing game. Rodney is, I believe it's said in the novel, he's kind of like all instinct. He just doesn't care about the consequences. He just figures out what he needs to do, and he does it. To some extent, this applies to Mazzilli. Mazzilli isn't worried about the pangs of guilt. He is not traumatized about his life as a homicide detective. And what seems to enable him to do this is that he is quite racist. He describes many of the criminals that are incarcerated, most of whom are black or Latino, as animals. He uses the N-word at least once, and he even, when talking to Sean Toey, says certain people just shouldn't live with other people. So pretty clear that Mazzilli just believes, for whatever it's worth, that whites and non-whites should not live together, and that that's what's causing all the crime and violence. Now, Rocco does not harbor such explicit racial attitudes, but he certainly doesn't correct Mazzilli when he says these things. He doesn't call out his friend. He kind of just laughs it off and thinks, well, it's a bit of a joke. The idea that, well, I wouldn't go that far, but I'm also not going to condemn the guy for saying what he's saying. That being said, Rocco does harbor some, maybe not animus, but certainly some quasi-racist ideas, which do come into play with his interactions with Strike. Strike, of course, being a black drug dealer. Rocco does at one point use the N-word himself, but the difference is we actually get insight into his inner monologue, and he does feel quite guilty about using that word, especially using it to address a black person. So that is the antagonist, or arguably the protagonist, Rocco Klein. All right. Now, on to the assessment of the novel. Obviously, because I'm making a video and I have said explicitly that this is my favorite novel, I'm a huge fan of Clockers. One thing that I find really enjoyable about the novel, even though it's not necessarily new or novel, is its structure. So all of the odd-numbered chapters are closely centered around Strike. Now, the novel is third person, but it is third person limited. So while it's never narrated from the point of view of Strike, the odd numbered chapters are very much centered around not only his experience, but his thoughts and his point of view. Well, his perspective, I'll say, to not get confused. The even numbered chapters are all centered around Rocco and give us insight into his own thoughts and feelings, as well as his actions and experiences. So it is a little bit confusing. So on the one hand, it does seem like Strike is the protagonist, Rocco is the antagonist, but it is done in such a way where you're really not sure who exactly to root for. And in some ways, that's kind of the appeal of the novel. This also gets to the heart of the novel, and I think why it is such an exemplary piece of work is that realistically, there are no bad guys or good guys. Surely Rodney Little and Champ, and to an extent Larry Mazzilli, are very abhorrent, unlikable characters. But Rocco Klein, who's a homicide detective, is no more sympathetic than Strike, who is a 19-year-old drug dealer. You also have to consider that this was at a time when crack was, enemy number one. This was when there was the scare, just after the scare in the 80s, and it was still continuing on. The scare of crack babies, very much the Reaganomics belief that they needed to crack crack down, pardon the pun, on drug trafficking, that they really wanted to throw crack dealers in jail and throw away the key. So the idea of having the hero of the novel and making him as sympathetic as possible, a drug dealer, was quite new and quite groundbreaking, and I'm sure for a lot of people quite mind-blowing. Another great thing about this novel is, of course, the dialogue. Richard Price is famous in the show business world as a master of dialogue. He has been compared to Quentin Tarantino. You very much get the feeling that you are hearing working class, blue collar New Jersey guys that you're hearing New Jersey cops and you're hearing New Jersey drug dealers. Richard Price did painstaking research, not only meaning that he read books, that he did research in libraries, but he very much was in the field. He rode in the back of police cars. He went to prisons. He spoke to police officers, police detectives. He also spoke to what he called the police, so people in these communities where the police were constantly raiding them, were constantly knocking down doors, people who were being the subject of, well, police harassment and police brutality. That gets to another part of the novel which I really like, which kind of is self-explanatory, which is the realism. One thing that you should know is that one of the reasons why I think murder mystery is a bit misleading is that this novel is actually very light on plot, but in a good way. The plot is simply that someone in Strike's gang is murdered. No one knows who committed the murder, including Strike. And both Strike and Rocco Klein are in their own ways trying to investigate the murder, find out exactly what happened. The reason why Strike is investigating it is different from Rocco's, but I don't want to spoil it, so I'm just going to leave it at that. So this is a very, very simple plot, but it provides a vehicle for us to explore this world of Dempsey and explore the war on drugs. You very much get to see the tenement buildings, the projects, the stairwells, the precincts, the interrogation rooms, the motels where prostitutes and pimps are plying their trade. You also get to really find out the working class people who are trying to scratch out a living in this very poor, very downtrodden city that has been swallowed up by the drugs, by the crack epidemic or the war on drugs. So that's a very appealing part of the novel, the fact that there's not constantly these plot twists that might seem out of nowhere, that might seem unnecessary, and there's no gratuitous violence. It certainly has some violent aspects and quite a bit of the grotesque, but there's no shootouts, there's no car chases, and that I think is very appealing. So that, of course, gets the world building. The character development is wonderful. There's another aspect to this novel that I think is that makes it quite exemplary, which is how subversive it is. So as I said, Strike is the hero despite being a crack dealer, and this being at a time when people were terrified of crack. People thought that anyone who sold crack was on the level of being a pedophile, essentially. There's also aspects where it de-romanticizes the gangster genre and the police procedural. So starting with Rocco Klein is very much the antagonist. And that's despite the fact that he is a detective. He's the police. He is, for all purposes, in our mind, the good guy. We see it from Strike's perspective, that Strike truly doesn't know what happened to this person who died, but Rocco is absolutely certain that Strike is the perpetrator. We very much begin to sympathize with Strike and feel sorry for him, and Rocco gradually becomes more and more aggressive as the novel continues towards its conclusion. There's also the aspect of Rocco is very much part of the system. He is just a cog in the big machine of the prison industrial complex and the war on drugs. Rocco Klein is not Philip Marlowe. He doesn't play by his own rules. He doesn't have his own office. He works very much for the system. He is a homicide detective for the city. He is beholden to the city. And when he does start to break some of the rules, there are a lot of consequences for it. And we really see that those decisions are not always done in earnest. He's not this great rebel character that we might be used to with the traditional dime store hard-boiled detective novels or the traditional action movie or crime drama. We also see many of the tropes that are often played out in police procedurals, both in novel form and in movie form, done in a very unromantic, very realistic way. Specifically, that Rocco Klein does start to go against procedure. He does start to jettison much of the requisite steps of the job, but he does so in a way that ultimately doesn't pay off, and it really does kind of diminish his credentials as a detective. And I should have mentioned this earlier, but Rocco Klein is certainly a good detective. That is how he's introduced. He is very even-handed. He is able to investigate a murder case effectively. We see at one point someone comes forward with a complaint against their spouse, and Rocco was able to decipher that it was a false accusation. We very much see that he has this strategy of when there's a murder, he will go at the back of the crowd that's forming around the body, and he will start to pretend like he's just another onlooker and ask questions and just listen to the chit-chat. So Rocco Klein is a good detective, but only when he's working within the confines of the job. When he starts breaking away from those confines, it ultimately impacts him negatively, and it impacts the investigation in a very negative way. And also, this novel, in many ways, is subversive of the gangster romance, or the gangster movie, or the gangster novel. Rodney, Strike, and Champ, they're not Don Corleone. They're not Nino Brown from New Jack City. They are very much limited individuals. Strike, as I've mentioned, is highly strung, very anxious. He doesn't live in some sumptuous mansion. He doesn't live in some gorgeous penthouse downtown. He just lives in a slightly nicer apartment than he would have lived in with his mother. And of course, he still sort of lives in the same building as his mother because he sells drugs there. Rodney Little is only clever when it comes to the streets. He doesn't have a head on him for finance or academic ideas. He's not a Don Corleone type of character. And Champ himself is described as bummy, obese, and he's also only 19 years old. He's 19 years old, and he's the kingpin of a large drug gang, and it very much seems like it's only a matter of time until he'll eventually be either murdered or taken down. It is emphasized in much of the exposition of the novel and some of the dialogue that the turnaround for drug dealers in this game is very short, meaning that they're either killed or they go to prison. So it's like you're out there for 6 months and then you're either gunned down or you're in prison, and that's it. You have to be extremely skilled and extremely lucky to make a career out of this. And even then, you're probably going to see prison time off and on. Another brilliant aspect of this novel, which makes it kind of a time capsule, I don't think it makes it dated, I just think it really shows how well Price captured this particular time during the war on drugs, is that you have a character in Strike's gang who is an AIDS-infected hitman. So Rodney Little's kind of Luca Brasi enforcer friend is Errol Barnes. Errol Barnes is the same age as Rodney, which is about the mid to late 30s, but he looks like a 6-year-old man. And the reason why is because he's HIV positive, he has AIDS, he is dying from the disease, but he has this reputation from when he used to be a very formidable killer, and that is able to keep many of the younger drug dealers in line because they're just scared of him. They've heard the urban legends about him. Specifically, we're introduced that Errol Barnes accidentally killed a local newscaster and got off for it, or got off, didn't have to serve time for it. You also have to remember that during this time, being infected with AIDS, that was a certain death sentence and a very short death sentence. So you were going to die imminently. So the idea that Errol Barnes is this bad man, that he's this enforcer, that he is this scary gunslinger who is just withering away from the virus, that is very subversive and very telling of the times. I'll also just add, Errol Barnes's fate at the end of the novel really kind of punctuates how much Clockers is really trying to display the reality of life in this game and trying to de-romanticize much of both the police procedural and the gangster mystique that you see in a lot of novels and a lot of movies. Wrapping this up, obviously I really enjoyed this novel. There aren't a lot of shortcomings that I can think of. Perhaps one shortcoming is that there are some times that things tend to happen to Strike rather than him making things happen. Strike is certainly an active character just because he is so conflicted and so resistant to much of what Rodney and other characters like Errol are trying to put him through. But there is kind of this aspect of him kind of just walking along and, again, things sort of happening to him and him reacting to them. That being said, that's in many ways offset by Rocco, who is a very active character in the novel. So, very slight shortcoming. Also, I would have liked to have found out more about Rodney's attempt to usurp Champ as the local kingpin of the Dempsey drug world. But that being said, I've read this novel 3 times. I'll definitely read it many times more. I highly recommend it. I'm going to give it 5 stars. 5 stars out of 5 or a 10 out of 10. I highly recommend it if you are a fan of crime and you're looking for something new, something really innovative. I recommend it if you love the show The Wire or if you love the show The Sopranos. Not so much The Sopranos, but certainly The Wire was very explicitly patterned off of this book. David Simon has made no bones that Clockers was a huge inspiration for the show. I also recommend this book if you just love literature, if you love a good novel and you love some of the older American literature such as John Steinbeck. And I don't know that you could really compare Richard Price to Steinbeck exactly, but I personally kind of found that Clockers and much of Richard Price's work has that kind of Steinbeck-esque feel where it's very working class. It has a very lean plot, and it's going after a lot of, how do I put this, very urgent themes. So themes of systemic abuse, neglect, discrimination. So I would highly recommend it to people who love literature, who love Toni Morrison, Steinbeck, and others. If you are a fan of other type of crime writers, such as Dennis Lehane, Gillian Flynn, I do still recommend this book, but you should be aware it's not going to be exactly what you might be anticipating. It's not going to be a Michael Connelly type of novel. It's not a John Grisham. It's not a Stephen King type of thriller. The plot of this novel is very perfunctory, and it's all about the world building and the characters, which, as it should be, that's what makes this novel, I think, so prescient and such a paramount piece of work.